Good morning. I'm Stephen Leake. I'm an elder at the First Presbyterian Church of Mesquite, Texas, and I'm also the teacher of the Discipleship Sunday School class there. This morning we're continuing with our study of the Gospel of John, and I want to remind you that our curriculum is based upon the Daily Bible Study Series by Professor William Barclay, and we're using the New Revised Standard Version of the Bible. Now, last week we began chapter 7, and in those first few verses, Jesus' brothers were trying to talk him into going to the Festival of Booths in Jerusalem. And Jesus said he would not go. But we learned later that really his plan was to go secretly, not go at the beginning of the festival, but go in the middle of the festival. So this is where we take up with the scripture lesson today. John 7, verses 10 through 13. But after his brothers had gone to the festival, there he also went, not publicly, but as if it were a secret. The Jews were looking for him at the festival, saying, "Where is he?" And there was considerable complaining about him among the crowds. While some were saying, "He is a good man," others were saying, "No, he is deceiving the crowd." Yet no one would speak openly about him for fear of the Jews. Jesus chose his moment and went to Jerusalem. Here we have the reactions of the people when they were confronted by him. One of the supreme interests of this chapter is the number of such reactions. Now, there are 5 different reactions, and we'll study each one individually. And let me note here that some of the reactions occur later on in this chapter. In other words, from verses of scripture that we have not read yet. But we're going to go ahead and study these reactions in this particular lesson. First, there was the reaction of his brothers from verses 1 through 5 last week. It was really a reaction of teasing contempt. They did not really believe in him. They were really egging him on, as you might egg on a precocious child. We still meet that attitude of amused contempt for Christianity. Second, there was the hatred of the Pharisees and of the chief priests, verses 7 and 19. They did not hate him for the same reason. The Pharisees hated him because he refused to conform to their petty rules and regulations. If Jesus was right, then they were wrong, and they loved their own system more than anything else. The Sadducees were a political party. They did not observe the Pharisaic rules and regulations. Most of the priests were Sadducees, and they collaborated with the Romans. They did not want a Messiah, for when he came, their political setup would disintegrate and their comfortable lives would be gone. Both of these reactions issued in the consuming desire to eliminate Jesus. That from verses 30 and 32. When other people's ideals clash with those of Christ, they must submit or ignore them. Now, as an example, Hitler would not have Christians around him, for the Christians owed a loyalty to a higher power than the government. Fourth, there was an arrogant contempt, verses 15 and 47 through 49. What right had this man to come and lay down the law? Jesus had no cultural background. He had no training in the rabbinic schools. This was the reaction of academic snobbery. Many of the greatest poets and writers and politicians and evangelists have had no academic training at all. Fifth, there was the reaction of the crowds. They were interested in Jesus. When Jesus comes into our life, it's impossible to be indifferent. He's the most interesting person who ever lived. The people talked about him. They put forward their views about him, and they debated about him. Nothing helps us clarify our own opinions, like pitting them against someone else's. Mind sharpens mind like iron sharpens iron. That's from one of my favorite Proverbs 27:17. The danger is that we can discuss and debate religion for a lifetime and do nothing. And Christianity is all about acting. In this chapter, there's a whole series of verdicts on Jesus. And again, some of these verdicts will be in future scripture lessons, but we're going to go ahead and talk about them in this lesson. First, there's the verdict that he was a good man. That from our verse 12 today. That verdict is true, but it's not the whole truth. It was Napoleon who made the famous remark, "I know men, and Jesus Christ was more than a man." Jesus was truly human, but in him was the mind of God. When he speaks, it's not just a man speaking to us. If that were so, we might argue with his commands. When he speaks, it is God speaking to us. And Christianity means not arguing with his commands, but accepting them. Second, there's the verdict that he is a prophet. That too is true. Prophets foretell the will of God. They have lived so close to God that they know his mind and his purposes. And that is true of Jesus, but there's a difference. The authority of a prophet is delegated. Their message is not their own. Jesus has the right to speak not with delegated authority, but with his own authority. Third, there's the verdict that he's a deluded madman. He chose a cross when he might have had power. He was the suffering servant when he might have been the conquering king. He washed the feet of his disciples when he might have had people kneeling at his own feet. He came to serve when he could have subjected the world to servitude. He turned the world's standards upside down. In a mad world, he brought the sanity of God. Fourth, there's the verdict that he is a seducer. The Jewish authorities saw in him one who was leading people away from true religion. He was accused of every crime against religion, of being a Sabbath breaker, of being a glutton and a drunkard, of having disreputable friends, and of destroying Orthodox religion. The Jews preferred their idea of religion to his, and to them, by leading people away from their idea of religion, he certainly did appear to be a seducer. We all know that one of the hardest things to do is to admit that we are wrong, and so it was for the Jews. Fifth, there's the verdict that he was a man of courage. No one could ever doubt his sheer courage. He had the moral courage to defy convention and to be different. He had the physical courage that could bear the most terrible pain. He had the courage to go on when his family abandoned him, and his friends forsook him, and one of his own disciples betrayed him. Here we see him courageously enter Jerusalem when he knew it was not safe to do so. Six, there's the verdict that he had a most dynamic personality. Consider the verdict of the officers who were sent to arrest him and came back empty-handed. That from later in this chapter. They said, "Never has anyone spoken like this." When we consider how this Galilean carpenter faced the highest rulers in the land and dominated them until it was they who were on trial, we must admit that he was the most significant personality in history. Seventh, there's the verdict that he was the Christ, the anointed one of God. Nothing less will do. It is a fact that Jesus does not fit into any of the available human categories. Only the category of the divine will do. Before we leave the general study of this chapter, there are three other reactions to Jesus that we must know. First, there was the crowd's reaction of fear. They talked about him, but they were afraid to talk too loud. The Revised Standard Version translates it as muttering. Fear can keep people from expressing their faith. Second, the reaction of a certain number of the crowd was belief. These were the men and women who could not deny the evidence of their very own eyes. They heard what Jesus said. They saw what he did, and they believed. And there was the reaction of Nicodemus, and it was to defend Jesus. In that council of the Jewish authorities, his was the lone voice raised in Jesus' defense. It's the privilege that God has given us that we can all be advocates and defenders of Christ in the face of criticism and sometimes the mockery of others. That's our lesson this week. Today, I hope for you the continued blessings of God. Thank you for joining me.